Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be answering your questions that you've asked me over on my Instagram, The Real John P. From time to time, I post a Q&A feature where you can ask me questions about myself, Del Rey Watch, where we buy, sell, trade watches, my personal watch collecting, as well as pretty much anything. And I always do my best to respond here in this fashion, as well as chop it up and post it into shorter segments to Instagram Reels when I deem that it might be helpful to fellow watch collectors out there. So make sure to check my Instagram, The Real John P, where you can chime in and ask in the future. So we're going to run right into it. The first question that we have here from someone, they ask, is the Santos XL or the Tank XL better for a 7 3/4 inch wrist? So the Cartier Tank XL or the Santos XL, which is going to be better for the wrist? Well, they're totally different watches and they do sit much differently. But the good thing is the 7 3/4 inch wrist is in kind of that range right now where most of the brands are making, including Cartier, they're making watches to fit this wrist size. Very common wrist size, not quite the average, though things are certainly going in that direction. So either of these are going to fit pretty well on your wrist, in my opinion. One of them is a dress watch. One of them is more of a sportier watch if we're talking the Santos XL on the bracelet. So the choice is yours. I think both of them will work perfectly fine for your wrist size. The next question is, how does shipping work to the UK, customs, postage, etc.? So I'll go ahead and cover this kind of blanket statement here for the entire world. Most countries, and certainly countries that we ship to with Del Rey Watch, they have some type of import duties that are due to your tax collecting or your import authority. And these rules and laws change all the time. And they change not from the US end per se, but from the importing country as well. You know, there's, depending on different trade agreements and things, these things change all the time. So generally, it's always on the responsibility of the importer to keep track of these things, because when the different forms for customs get filled out, that is actually the person that does the importing is the receiver typically. There's other circumstances, but generally when you buy a product, you become the importer. So in terms of the import tax and all of that, both sides are involved, but that is something that generally the purchaser needs to keep up on. There is a certain percentage on certain goods, including precision instruments like watches. But in terms of shipping, there is great shipping insurance that we use that covers most countries. There are some places that can't be shipped to over certain dollar amounts, but generally we can ship to pretty much everyone that asks within reason. But these things can often get very nitty gritty when you get into the fine print on where you can send it, what you can send, so on and so forth. The next question is, which watch is my favorite? Now, I'm asked this all the time, and the reality is it just happens to be whatever watch that I'm wearing on that day is generally my favorite. That's why I probably put it on my wrist, whether it's a reason or a purpose for that day, like sporting or a dress watch. It's probably my favorite for that given moment. And the reality is, because I'm very fortunate and lucky and privileged to have access to see all the cool watches that come in the door at Del Rey Watch, in other companies prior, I generally am able to scratch my kind of watch collecting, watch geek itch in that way, and not necessarily have to always be, getting into a different watch. Personally, for my collection, it becomes much more utilitarian. As boring as that is the circumstance. So unfortunately, no favorite watch per se. Now that takes us into the next question. What is my Grail watch? Which watch would I choose? If you're not familiar, the Grail watch is essentially a watch that you mark in your collection that would be kind of the end all be all. And I've done a video on this in the past. I think Grail watches oftentimes, and this happened for me and this happens for so many collectors, once you kind of set that target on the Grail watch, you get the watch, it may not be exactly what you thought. And even if it is, generally something will come out or you'll discover something, because watches, there's so much to discover. There's so many different watches, even in back catalogs, even watches that are being discovered that people didn't know about to this day that go to auction and fetch these premiums. And now maybe that collector wants that watch. And so generally with Grail watches, I try not to, it's something that when I started out watch collecting, when I was young, 18, 19 years old, I had some Grail watches. But then after I ended up, putting them on my wrist or being able to obtain them, things changed. My life changes, and the types of watch that I wear every day change with my lifestyle too. So Grail watch, unfortunately, I know a bit of a bummer here, but I don't have a Grail watch per se. Next question, what is a great under-the-radar vintage watch? Now, I'll say that Enicar I really think is underappreciated. It's kind of a niche brand from a family that produce these watches. Majority of them are these sports watches that you find out there from the Sherpa line. There are some others, not only from the Sherpa line, but other lines of Ennakar that are not. They're more dressier watches, but the sporting watches like the Sherpa Graph, and the divers, I think they're awesome. They use EPSA cases often. The Picorez compressor cases that were made to surpass the water depth ratings of Rolex and the like of the time. And they are really cool watches with awesome heritage and quality. And you can still find them at reasonable prices, but they're drying up with a lot of other vintage. So I've been saying this for a couple years, but as the prices have come up, good examples of these watches certainly have as well. So I would check out watches from Ennakar. Which Seiko would I choose from the current collection? Well, the most recent Seiko that I did add to my collection from the current collection would be actually the Rowing Blazers, the recent Rowing Blazers collaboration with Seiko. I really love this watch. It's green. It's got an interesting hue of green. I also have the previous versions as well, but this one is current catalog. There may even be one or two of these floating around at different distributors or authorized dealers online. I think it's cool, it's fun, it's quirky, and it's something a little bit different that's just not in, off-the-shelf standard in-house designer for the brand, outside design. And, the guys over there do a pretty good job, or more than pretty good. They do a great job. I know they're going to see this. They do a phenomenal job at Rowing Blazers. I even have some of their clothing as well. They do a great job, so I like the collaboration. That would be my choice. The next question is, this person has an opportunity where they can trade their Vacheron Overseas for a Laureato and a Tudor Panda. Is this a good trade? Well, it really just depends which Overseas. If it's a modern gold Overseas, okay, well, the person who's giving up the Overseas is certainly losing here. But if it's a quartz-driven, 34 millimeter Overseas first gen, okay, well, then the other person is on the other side of this deal. So it really just depends on the particular Overseas. But I will say that personally, I really like the Laureato, but modern Overseas just have a little more fit and finish, dare I say, than the modern Laureato watches. But I think, we're splitting hairs at that point. And personally, I do like the overall profile of the Laureato. So something to consider. But the Tudor chronographs can be had. They're readily available. They're not in super high demand. And there has been a little bit of a demand pullback in the Laureato as things like the Royal Oak are a little more available, as well as some of the other alternatives are a little more available, including the Overseas. So hopefully that at least gives you enough to make your decision. But really at the end of the day, it depends on the exact models, conditions, provenance, box of papers, but the choice is yours. So if you can make the numbers work, you know how to Google it, go to eBay, go to Chrono24, then why not if you like the deal. Next question is Breitling a good value? Well, it's kind of interesting, and this goes into another question is, what is my most recent acquisition? And it's actually going to be technically this Breitling Endurance Pro watch. No, I know that technically it's plastic or, a polymer or something like that for the chemists or the engineers out there. So yeah, technically, it's a polymer or a plastic. And it's quartz-driven watch, so we're not talking, hot horology here. But that's not where the value is for me. This is a watch that I really could just beat up, do anything, go anywhere, even more so than the other watches that I wear that I like for that reason. My Aquaterra, my OP, some of the other watches in my collection. This is quartz-driven, so I could literally do anything, and this quartz, movement is not going to be affected. It doesn't have the mechanics of the moving parts. And I just happen to be doing some things in the very near future where I just felt that, a little bit more sporty and action related. So I just wanted something a little more rugged and durable, especially with, backed up service times with our watchmakers at Del Rey Watch. So personally, this is my recent acquisition, and I put it on this canvas strap because it's even lighter than the rubber straps that Breitling supplies with the Endurance. I do like the rubber straps, but I have to say that Breitling offers two rubber strap sizes, big and ginormous. They don't offer a medium size. The rubber straps, there's so much rubber there. It's not for me. It's not for me, the rubber straps. They need to make a size that fits someone under a 7-inch wrist, but now I'm really rambling on. But nonetheless, recent acquisition. I like it. It's cool. Plastic, quartz, hate me. but I like it. And that's what's cool about watches. We can all have our preferences, and there's something for everyone for a purpose. I haven't got rid of my Pateks or anything like that, though. I'm not going quartz all the way. Next question is, what do I think is the next big color trend? This is tricky because, most recently, we've gone through the white, we've gone through the green, we've gone through the blue dials, and I think it could be a purple. There's this color, the Pantone colors. They're very notable for essentially creating colors. And every year they have, like a color scheme or a color of the year. And most recently there was a shade of a purple, and that's kind of what follows into the fashion world. They use these Pantone colors a lot of the times, and it kind of becomes the hot trend. So maybe something like a purple was the last color that I've seen, and purple OP and some of the other watches out there, kind of shades of that I've seen as well. But aside from that, I think, it might just be a mixture of color or patterns or maybe collaborations. I know collaborations is not a color, but instead of it being a color, it could just be collaborations. The brands probably have to do something with the tightening in the economies here and the spending of people to captivate or bring in new buyers and still be able to raise their prices. So I think collaborations could help them do it. So not a color, same kind of idea, collaborations. Ridiculous, I know. Now, someone asks me, why quartz? Well, maybe they're talking about my Breitling watch here, the Endurance, or maybe they're asking what are the pros and cons. So a quartz movement, if it's a proper Swiss thermocompensated quartz movement, that's going to be able to account for the irregularities of the temperature. Quartz movements are affected by temperature a lot, much more than the mechanical movements. And so because of this, there's different movements. And so these are the movements that you want to look for in the quartz watches. But assuming that the watch does have this, if it's Swiss, it likely does. We're talking not a lot in terms of cost difference for the brand, so they should be using these types of movements. The watch is going to be more resistant to many things, including shock, sporting. That is a very big pro. I hear more than a few times per year of people that get a Royal Oak and then they go snowboarding or skiing or something, they take a tumble and the rotor falls off or something like that. Now, it's not happening with every watch, but we run a service center, so we do see these bizarre instances, and that's just not going to be the case with a quartz movement because there's really nothing to fall off. Oh, is the battery going to pop out? Probably not. It's held down by a clamp, but that is the one consideration that you do need to keep in mind, is that the batteries do need to be replaced. Now, some movements and batteries can maybe last up to 8 years, but that's on the very extreme end. Generally, 3 years is kind of where brands like Omega in the past, when they did have quartz in their catalog openly, recommended a battery swap. I'm not talking about something like the FP Journe Elegant, which the movement stops and saves battery life, nothing like that. But generally a couple years, and that's something you have to keep in mind, is aside from the battery swaps, if the movement does break, you really have to replace the movement. Now, for a modern watch, fine, hey, the brand's going to do it. But when you start talking about a watch that becomes vintage, it can become a little bit more tricky. And we see that with some vintage quartz watches. Maybe there's not a direct replacement if we're talking about specific modified quartz movements. But the reality is there's not too many quartz movements from high-end manufacturers out there, with the exception of probably Grand Seiko and I guess Breitling if we throw them in the mix. So these are the considerations, but really different watches for different purposes besides time telling at the end of the day. Someone asked, what is my watch collecting philosophy? Now, I really don't have too much of a watch collecting philosophy. I tend to like watches that are a little bit different or unique or special, but you generally have to look a little bit closer to tell. For example, my Rolex 1016 Explorer has a frogfoot dial, so that's kind of interesting about it. When I had the 16550 Explorer 2, it was an interesting variation of the watch as well. When I had the Rolex 16800, for example, it was kind of that spider web aging dial. And other watches, double signed watches from different authorized dealers over the year, like my Tiffany Breguet, or things like that. That's generally what I'm picking up. It's not like I plan out what I'm going to put in my collection, but when something comes in the door, or I see something in a dealer chat group, or I'm offered something and it's interesting, generally those sit in my collection for a while because I just know that if it's kind of special in that way, it's, where else is that going to pop up? I might as well hold on to it, see if I like it, if it's special and unique in that kind of way. And just finding it again becomes difficult. But if it's something very common off the shelf, let's talk a brand new sub, that can be found anywhere, not from authorized dealers, mind you, but that can be found anywhere on the internet. So generally I like something a little bit different and special if it's something that I think will probably stay in my collection. But other than that, I really don't have any rules. If something screams at me and it's, within reason, hey, I'll put it in my collection, see if it works. If not, glad to sell it, move it on for someone that it does. And I know this is a strategy I hear so many other watch collectors go towards. And generally, if someone builds this grand scheme of how they're going to collect it, at the end of the day, they end up, or really at the end of their collection, they get the final watch, like, well, I'm going to let this whole collection go, and then they end up selling it all. And we see this all the time. Someone collects every modern Tudor, and they're like, what am I doing with all these Tudors? And then they sell it to either us, Del Rey Watch, or on the market themselves. So that's generally what happens, but to each their own. Everyone can have their own strategy. The next question, where do you think Rolex prices are headed? Depends on the Rolex, depends on the model, and it depends on if it's vintage or modern. But the reality is Rolex is producing more watches. They've made endless statements recently saying they're building larger facilities. They're investing serious capital to being able to produce more watches. What else do they need to do? Do they need to invest money into increasing the quality of the watches? That's why they need all these new facilities? No. I mean, they are selling everything they produce. They're going to be producing more watches. And that being said, unless they start pumping out new models, they're going to be subs. They're going to be Datejust. They're going to be Oyster Perpetuals, maybe a little change here or there once per year. But they're going to be pumping these things out. And so I don't see the prices of them skyrocketing in the future, but they could come down a little bit, especially if the demand was not as high and the era of cheap money is gone. But only time will tell, a lot of factors, but I don't see us having kind of that run up again on the Rolex watches anytime soon. Next question, how do I get a corporate job in the watch industry? Well, personally, I'll say I did not have a corporate job in the watch industry. I was a longtime collector, and then I had a consulting company, and then I kind of got involved in the watch industry that way and kind of pivoted, and then we started Del Rey Watch, back mid 2017 at this point. So I didn't really, work my way up in the watch industry. I was in tech and, some other industries. And so I'll say, based on what I see, there's a lot of kind of inside promotion for different roles, and people oftentimes work from the bottom up with inside the watch industry. They work for an AD, or they work for a boutique or for a brand in that way, and they kind of get promoted, or they start shaking hands. They go to what used to be Balza World and maybe now Watches and Wonders and different trade shows. And as they know more people in the industry, they get kind of targeted for these positions. And I'll say if you have the maybe a goal to try to be like a president of a brand or something, look at the presidents, look at the executives and the figureheads of a lot of the brands. And there is a lot of optics involved in the luxury industry as well as the watch industry. Depending on the brand and what the brand conveys, the brands will put people in these, higher up corporate positions that kind of just look like they make sense for the brand. Now, that just might be something I've noticed. Maybe there's not official policy about this, but if you do look, this is oftentimes what corporations do when they sell something that's a little premium, right? Think of when they brought back Bob Iger for Disney. Well, they slapped him in a turtleneck and a sweater, put him in a pair of Nike sneakers. And mind you, a retired older man, absolute end of his late career. And then they threw him in the parks, had him walk around, take pictures. A lot of it is the optics for some of these companies that offer premium services and products, including the watches. So that being said, generally, you got to work up and you really have to be kind of that brand company man, spokesperson type of thing, or woman. You get the idea. That's generally how it seems to work when we talk about the brands and corporate. Now, if you want to work for an AD or something like that, much more different. You could probably walk in, and if you're a nice person, you know something about watches, they'll put you in there. But you want to start working up in a brand, this is generally what I see, kind of a who you know, do you make sense for the brand, and do you fit kind of that brand image? It's what I see. Don't shoot the messenger. Now, the last question, and I like this question. This is, do I see value in Zenith for the year 2023? Do you see it being maybe similar to Girard-Perregaux? So the interesting thing about Zenith is I think Zenith watches offer a lot of great value out there, but because they really don't have a solidified model that people can say, that's Zenith, they have a movement. They have the El Primero and variations of the El Primero, and it's not like they have it's not like they're credited for having a chronograph. They're just really credited for having this El Primero movement. So as long as that stays constant, I think Zenith is going to continue to deliver really great value, maybe not at retail price because things have been going up, but because they pump these things out and because they don't have that recognition universally, I think they offer a lot of great value because they produce some good watches. But they're LVMH, and LVMH has every trick up their sleeve. Think of the brands, think of the companies, Louis Vuitton, Moet, all of these companies that are heavily reliant on portraying super high-end status, whether or not it's true. That's the angle. And so I see them probably pushing up Zenith, and they need something to define the brand more than just this. It didn't work with the Day 5, the integrated bracelet design. Those watches, people buy them, but it's not super high demand. People are going towards the other integrated bracelets, and I'm not sure what they can do at this point. I'd have to think about it. But I think for the time being, get pre-owned, get a big discount. Zenith offers some good value for the money on the watches. If you like the watches and you do want to own one, give it a shot. So everyone, this has been my answers to your questions that you've asked on my Instagram, TheRealJohnP. Please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com where we buy, sell, trade watches. Everyone have a great week here, and we'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P.